Hi everybody. Okay, I'm back in Thailand. Yay. Alright. Okay. Need to start doing more of these kind of videos talk to the camera. Since I'm back in Thailand, I'm gonna talk about Thailand. Because my Thai kinda sucks and I don't have a translator, this is going to be more geared towards Western audiences, even though it's about Thailand. I'm looking for someone to work with me to do a translation video, to act as a translator, so I can do some videos in Thai too. But I want to give some deeper perspective on the recent elections and aftermath in Thailand than you're going to get in Western media, because they're given a very limited perspective, a very biased perspective, and I want to kind of flesh it out a bit. Now, what you're hearing in Western media is there was a recent election, it was actually 2 months ago, little more. And the Liberal or Progressive Party, one of them, won a big victory, unseating the conservative military government that had been in power for 9 years. And, well, yes, one party opposed to the current party in power won pretty heftily. That's true. The labels they're putting, not so much. What you'll hear is that the current government is very conservative. And interestingly, they might sometimes describe the party that recently won, Move Forward, as, sometimes they might use the word liberal, but a lot more often they're using a term you don't hear much in Western media: progressive. I mean, yeah, progressive is a fairly common term in politics, but usually, and it's actually, in terms of just the language, progressive is more of a direct opposite to conservative than the word liberal. But Western mainstream media usually use the word liberal. And I think, though, there's a reason they're using progressive this time. And it's simply this. First of all, okay, the labels of calling the current government conservative and the maybe incoming government, I'll get to that later, progressive, well, it just isn't that accurate. You could cherry pick certain issues and paint that picture, and you'd think that, at least according to what, in the West we would define as conservative and progressive. But you could cherry pick other issues and paint the opposite picture. Without going into all of it, one really clear example is that this party in power, that they're labeling as conservative, completely decriminalized marijuana in Thailand about a little over a year ago. Not only that, they released all prisoners incarcerated solely on cannabis-related offenses. No U.S. state that has legalized or decriminalized cannabis has let anybody out of jail, unless their sentence was up anyway. So regardless of what one thinks about the issue of legalizing marijuana / cannabis, it is not something that any self-labeled Western politician, self-labeled as conservative Western politician, would support. So right there is a situation where it really just um, doesn't fit what Western media is telling you about it. Um, Another thing you'll hear is that the current government is a military government. And now there's some truth to that. Actually, there's quite a bit of truth to it. But just saying that and not explaining more paints a very inaccurate picture from what people in the West will start thinking of when you say the term military government. Um, Now, when you hear military government in the West, you think martial law. That is not the case here. Okay. Yes, the current party, which is now kind of fractured, albeit amicably, into three different parties, did take power in a coup 9 years ago. However, the general leading the coup, Prayut Chan-o-cha, did hold an election in 2019 and won. And yes, some of his cabinet appointees are ex-military. Some aren't. But it's not like there's military on all the streets. Thailand is not a police state. It's still very safe. And it's safe because people are a lot friendlier than they are in the US. It's not because there's a hard-ass military government around. People don't go walking down the streets wondering if the military is going to jump out and get them or start harassing them. And if people of color come here from the US, they're usually treated a whole lot friendlier by the cops, including if military is playing that role, which usually not. Than they're getting in the U.S. So, yeah, that needs to be clarified. You know, that needs to be fleshed out, and the Western mainstream media ain't doing it, and they're painting this very skewed picture. Now, why are they painting this skewed picture? Well, it's really obvious. It's because the ones who got elected are are Western puppets. It's not to say they don't have occasionally good ideas or things like that, but that's where the loyalty lies. The winning opposition party in the general election is actually called Move Forward. That is not a translation of a Thai phrase. That is their actual name, Move Forward, or the Move Forward Party. Doesn't take a genius to figure out that a Thai political party with an English name might not have their loyalties to Thailand. You know, kind of obvious there. But why did they lose so bad? Why did the current government lose so bad? When the opposition was, basically Western puppets. And really that is kind of a screw up on the current government's fault. It's kind of on them. Not that they did a bad job, I don't think. Thailand's really progressed a lot over their rule, during their rule. But what happened is they kind of shut the people. They kind of stopped listening. They initially took power in a coup, but then won a general election. And then they tried to just keep the peace all nicey nice. And it just kind of didn't fly, When people had grievances, they're like, oh, let's just forget the past. Let's just look to the future. Let's forget. And then people just weren't buying that. especially the younger crowd. Um, Again, not to say that I don't think the policies were all that bad. They weren't perfect. No one is, but um, the economy's done well. Um, it took a big hit during COVID, but that was when you have a country that anywhere from 12 to 20% of their GDP is tourism, and there's a pandemic. I don't care who's in power; they're taking a hit. One thing I think both um, political sides have really neglected is maybe um, started talking about how do we how does Thailand not be so dependent on tourism? But instead, when the pandemic hit, there was the big concern is, um, when are we going to get when are we going to get the tourists to come back? Or then, gee, how can we maybe restructure our economy a little bit so we ain't so dependent? So if there's another pandemic, we're not going to take as big a hit. Yeah. Now, interesting enough, though, but again, going with the whole conservative progressive label that the Western or English language in general media is using to describe each political faction. It was actually the quote unquote conservative government that wanted to put the health of the nation first, and realizing that as much of a hit as the economy is taking, the health of the nation comes first, and then we'll worry about getting the tourists back quick. And it was actually the quote unquote progressive that was complaining that they weren't doing it fast enough and that the economy was the more important issue. Which I really think that those labels would be flip-flopped in terms of behavior in the West. So, again, that's another example of where, and I'm not saying necessarily that the party in power, faction in power, is more progressive, and that the newly elected opposition is more conservative. I'm not saying that either. I'm just saying, throw out the terms. They just don't fit to what's going on here. And in terms of, I did make the accusation of the opposition being Western puppets. Now it says the candidate who initially won the prime ministership, and I say initially because it looks like he ain't gonna get it. I'll get to that later. He did campaign on some issues that would sound progressive. One of the big ones, I think was a good thing, was he wanted to raise the daily minimum wage by close to 50%. Yeah, I'm all for that. I don't think raising minimum wage is a long-term solution, but I do think it helps. A lot of people like to argue against that, saying, oh, but that'll create inflation. Guess what? There's inflation anyway. Actually, Thailand's is kind of low. Compared to what a lot of other countries are going through right now, relatively. So even, there's always going to be some inflation anyway, so a raise of the minimum wage always is at least a temporary help to the working class. However, after winning the election, his name's Pita Limjaronrat. And after winning the election, he met with the Chamber of Commerce, telling them about it, and hasn't said a word about it since. So he could have just been saying it to get elected. Now his party Move Forward is okay. Even though he was the prime ministerial candidate for him, the head honcho of the party is a guy by the name of Tanachan Jungrungkit, who has very actively been a Western sellout. See, but it all comes, the big overshadowing issue in all this is the almost here, maybe already here, Cold War between the US and China. And what Thailand wants, I'd say most people, most lay people, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum, they want peace, and they want to have good relations with all countries, be able to trade with all countries, have other people come here and show them their hospitality, especially if they're coming here and spending some money. And that's not just Thailand, but really Southeast Asia in general. If I get friends in Vietnam and in Malaysia, and they pretty much say the same thing. They really, Southeast Asia as a whole, Thailand included, really just, I don't think, wants to be picking a side in the whole U.S.-China competition. Or call it a trade war, an economic war, a Cold War too. And of course, the danger is Cold Wars can always turn into hot wars, and that ain't good. And that's what Thai people, lay Thai people on both sides of the political spectrum want. However, because the U.S. is getting its panties in a bunch over China being able to match it economically, the U.S. is basically slush funding various political candidates, and the guy who won is one of them. Now, I haven't personally caught Pita. There's been no stories about him actually cutting a shady deal with any Western nation or politician. But Thanaton, the party godfather, very much did. As a matter of fact, you can just easily Google his name, Thanaton. Started with a TH. And the word Hyperloop. And see, what's going on is there's one of the big, you might call it economic deals going on between Thailand and China right now is Thailand working with China on their Belt and Road Initiative. China had plans to work with all Southeast Asian nations to build a network. One of the first big ones going into Southeast Asia has already started. It's already going through Laos. That's right, Laos, poorest country in Southeast Asia, has high-speed rail when the U.S. doesn't. And it's currently being built in Thailand. It's eventually going to go all the way down to Singapore. Now, it was not an easy negotiation here. China offered a deal to Laos, and Laos took it immediately. It's like, hey, we got high-speed rail, cool. Didn't negotiate much. But what China wanted in return for building the high-speed rail in Thailand is they wanted sovereignty over, the thin stretch of land that the tracks laid on. Thailand, being the country in Southeast Asia that resisted colonization successfully, as you can imagine, said, hell no. But we like the idea of a railroad. Tell you what, we'll buy your tech, we'll build it ourselves. And after China didn't really like that, it was kind of, there's some tension for a while, but eventually China said, well, tell you what, why don't you pay us to build it, and then the sovereignty over the tracks is yours. And Thailand said, okay. And it's currently being built. Actually, the line goes right through the city I'm in. I can actually, if I go out my door, I can see it. I can see the overpass that's being built for the new tracks. And so that's one of the big trade deals that at least this current government is, probably past governments too, I think, were part of the negotiations on. But see, what happened with the godfather of the Move Forward Party, Tanaton, he had these meetings, went out himself to this company called Hyperloop, which is a prototypical high-speed rail company it's like Bay Area or Central California, U.S., I forget which town. But Hyperloop has not built a single mile of usable track, as anyone in the U.S. knows, because there ain't no high-speed rail there. We Americans know this. We just got old Amtraks. So he wanted to basically scrap the whole deal with China and have Hyperloop build the track. Now, you might think there might be a problem with, well, what if they're not compatible? Well, if that was I don't think that would be the case. That would be political suicide. But that's, I don't think, what's really going on. Because if basically Thailand said, okay, China, screw your deal, we're going to have the U.S. build, a U.S. contractor build the track, the benefit, other than the actual money from whatever company gets the contract, is still going to be the trade between Thailand and China, and of course Laos in the middle, and eventually, of course, Malaysia and Singapore, where they hope the track to end at eventually. And this will not only be for trade, there'll be multiple tracks, so it'll be both for trade and for passengers. But what's really, I think, going on here is the meeting with Hyperloop wasn't to just switch contractors from a Chinese one to an American one, but more or less to scrap the project. Because again, the U.S. is jealous of China's rise, and they want to use China's neighbors to screw with it. And where Tanaton himself would have a vested interest in it is that he's the guy who owns the largest auto parts manufacturing company in Thailand. Or, well, actually, he's the heir to it. His dad died when he was pretty young. His mom actually owns the company. But anyway, he's an auto parts mogul. And he's engaging in these deals that look like it's going to scrap a high-speed rail project. Conflict of interest, big time. So this is, what PTA comes out of. Now, like I said, I haven't caught PTA actually part of any deals like that. I don't know of any stories about that. And ultimately, you want to judge the guy on his own merits, not just his association with the party of Tanaton. But when you have things like him guaranteeing, him promising to raise the minimum wage and then asking the Chamber of Commerce about it and shutting up, because that's just going to allow for more exploitation of Thai labor, from not just Thai corporations, but of course foreign corporations as well. So yeah, it's kind of a head, so things like that, they're head scratchers. Now, another issue here is the other opposition party. Now, the other opposition party actually won some elections and got thrown out twice for corruption, and that's Phú Thai. The godfather of that party, Thaksin Shinawatra, is in exile in Dubai. Can't return because he'd be facing corruption charges if he returned. He was thrown out in 2005, 2006, I think, one of those years. And now he did some things that did make him popular among the Thais. For example, he did revamp the Thai healthcare system, and it dropped the cost of medicine in Thailand down big time. People loved it, and they should. Now the problem was it was starting to bankrupt the Thai medical system. Now when the military took over, they did raise things a little bit, but they didn't completely undo it. Only, actually, they left most of it there. They just had to raise prices some. People still weren't, of course, happy about that. Was there a way they could have maybe redistributed the funds and kept the medical system Thaksin had set up in place without bankrupting the medical system? Probably. I don't have the books in front of me. There's a will, there's a way. But when what Thaksin had set up was bankrupting the country, not bankrupting the country, but at least its medical system, you can't help but wonder if it was a ploy to let that happen and gain some popularity from it, blame elsewhere if it failed, and then let let big pharma, and big tech come on in, which of course would be screwing over the Thai people and raising the prices up to like US stuff in Thailand. Not good. Nonetheless, because Thaksin was the guy who did drop medical prices in Thailand big time, despite the very likely ulterior motive, you can understand why people were a little ticked off when he got thrown out. Now, there was some other nasty shit he did that people were ready to get rid of him. In particular, he did a quote-unquote war on drugs, which cracked down on a whole lot of people who weren't really drug dealers at all. It's estimated that the cops killed, in a matter of a few years, some 1,300 civilians. That's putting it close up to, putting Thailand for that short period close to the U.S. in terms of citizens murdered by the police. Funny how that hasn't happened under the military government. Again, so when they say military, well, let's look at what really was a police state. And it happened under someone labeled somewhat of progressive, but was a Western puppet. That was what actually created a temporary time in Thailand of a huge escalation in the police murder of civilians. He was thrown out the day after he met with the Council on Foreign Relations, and you can understand, because a global South nation meeting with them is tantamount to treason. And in 2011, his sister was elected because he still had some popularity. His sister got elected. Military threw her out. The current military government threw her out in 2014. Would she have been thrown out if she wasn't? Her name was Yingluck. Would Yingluck have been thrown out if she wasn't Thaksin's sister. I don't know. I don't know. We can speculate on that, I guess. So now we're the reason why I bring up this other party, Putai, is because they won the second most votes. It's kind of a little different in the Thai elections. You don't necessarily vote for candidates for each seat. You just kind of vote for a party, and whoever their pick for X position is, kind of gets it. So so they're like second in line. Now what happened is the Constitution in Thailand keeps getting revamped as different parties come into power. It's not like the U.S. where they hold it as all that sacred. It's like, okay, well, we need to change it because that's what we need to do to make things work, then they do it. Which I kind of agree with. But they won the second most seats in the general election. Now, in order, though, for the winner of the general election to win the prime ministership, they're basically voted on by the parliament, which is two houses, the parliament and the Senate. So it's kind of very much like the U.S. Electoral College system, where whoever gets the most votes in the general election does not necessarily win the prime ministership. Now, the lower house, the parliament, would be the equivalent of the House of Representatives, is elected. The Senate, though, is all appointed by the current government. The current prime minister and the cabinet. So even though there were less seats, it's like 500 in the lower house, 250 in the upper house. So granted, because of the division, because despite the three different parties that the current government is kind of fractured into, albeit amicably, lost a lot of seats in the House, they still control the Senate, so there was not, with what they did control in the House, there was not enough for Pita to win a majority. They voted on it twice, they brought up the motion twice, he couldn't do it, he couldn't win it. So now, and of course, there's like time for them to negotiate with, okay, can we bring other parties to okay this if we're willing to compromise on this or that. And he didn't on some things, which I'll get into a little later. And so twice trying to get the parliamentary win for the prime ministership, he failed. So now Putai is trying to put together their own coalition and nominate somebody and see if they can sway some of those appointed by the current government to vote for them and compromise on some things that Pita was not willing to compromise on. And the big issue there is what is called Article 112. It's a really short law. You can look up an English translation of it. It's only like a line and a half. It's basically Thailand's lèse majesté law, which means you can't diss the king, the queen, the past kings, the regent. Now, oftentimes it'll be reported this is like a really harsh, draconian law. Not really. I mean, in terms of enforcement, it's more like the speed limit. People break it all the time when the cops aren't around, kind of thing. Um, no, there is not an Article 112 secret police, looking to see who's, saying stuff privately. Doesn't happen. Um, but yeah, you can get some jail time if you publicly diss the king or certain other members of the royal family. Like I said, I think it's past. It also applies to past kings, the queen, and any temporarily appointed regent. Um, Not sure if any other members of the family are on it. You can look it up. But the West will often talk about it being a very draconian law. Not really. I mean, there were some protests back late 2020 that got 50 some people charged with violations of Article 112. Very few were arrested. Most were summoned, So it's hard to call it, draconian. When they actually just kind of, send a cop to your door to serve you a summons to appear in court rather than haul you off. There were some arrested, but I think it was only like maybe 5 to 10% of the people charged. And interestingly enough, there were a lot of those who were charged. There were a whole lot. I mean, you can get up to 15 years for it, but a lot of the people who were charged with Article 112 violations weren't given any sentence. Yeah, it was like the judge said, you're found guilty of violating Article 112. Go on, get the hell out of here. I'm sure it didn't actually come down in those words, but you get the idea. But there have been some people who did get harsh sentences. Then there have been some people who got harsh sentences who probably didn't deserve them. It's not so much a reflection on the law so much as it is a probably harsh and cruel judge who had the case. And you can understand why a country like Thailand that was Southeast Asia's one country that successfully resisted being colonized by the West, wanting to have a law on the books that can kind of be used as their ace in the hole card. Find a way to get somebody on that is causing trouble, politically undermining the national security, but you can't really quite get them on anything else. And on the other side, it's the whole question of freedom of speech. So there's not an easy answer to that one. You can't expect a relatively small, not super small. I mean, Thailand's 70 million people, so they're about 1%. Maybe just slightly less than 1% of the world's population. Certainly smaller countries, but they're not huge. And you can certainly, you can't expect them to play by the rules of the West, or they'll lose. So you can understand them wanting to have something like that on the books for the national security. At the same time, there are people who are incarcerated, perhaps unfairly. It's not an easy answer to it. But to say that it's just this nasty draconian law and the Thai government's all just mean and everybody lives in fear of, getting brought up on violating 112. No. No, that doesn't happen here. There's relatively few people charged with it. But it is Thailand's biggest wedge issue. often if you see the number of people it impacts versus how much various economic policies impact people, it ends up being a big distraction from the economic issues. But because it was the the Thai monarchy that was one of the unifying forces, especially during the reigns of some particular kings, that allowed Thailand to stay unified, to resist colonization. It's very easy to understand that it would be the Western corporatocracy that would have its neo-colonial puppets want to take the law down so that they can exploit Thailand. It's a messy issue. It's not an easy answer. But I hope that when you hear in Western news what they're saying about 112, about what they're saying about the quote-unquote military government, that you'll realize that there's another side to the issue, and it's a complex one. There's not simple answers. There's a lot of nuance to these issues. But to take just a Western standard and chalk it up and judge Thailand, you get them calling this guy progressive, calling the opposition newly elected parties progressive, even though you can certainly argue the opposite, is just outright racism, because it's trying to say that progress for Thailand equals westernization. Thailand's going to develop as Thailand will. So I've been over 40 minutes. I hope those of you who are just hearing these little 2-minute blurbs about Thailand in world news maybe now have a little better perspective and can realize it's a much deeper, much more nuanced issue than what you've heard so far.